What's up, guys? Happy Tuesday. Welcome back to another episode of Eat, Train, Prosper. Today, Bryan and myself are going to have a larger conversation around metabolic training, both systemic and local. And before we get into that, we have a couple question updates from a previous episode where we had a little bit of the wrong Instagram link, I think, to a James Krieger post switch. So we're going to follow up on that. And then we have one other question or two from Instagram as well that are larger conversation questions, which are going to be cool to talk about before we jump into the meat of today's episode. But before we get into these, Bryan, what's the latest with you?
Yeah. So you said James Krieger, you probably meant Chris Beardsley, which was the name of the person. So just to correct that real quick. But I have a bunch of updates, so I'm not going to spend too much time on any of them. I feel like maybe in a future episode, we can talk a little bit more about my diet as we go through. But essentially, the big update on my diet from the last episode to now is that it started. My official weight on Friday when we got back from San Diego was 194.8 in the morning. So I had estimated on the last episode that I was mid to high 190s. I said I'd probably have about 16 pounds to lose. As it turns out, I was slightly under the mid 190s. So 194.8 is my starting point. Now we're on Tuesday. So I've been, quote, dieting for 4 days now. And I just woke up on Tuesday and my weight is 194.8, still the exact same as it was on Friday. But on the in-between days, it dropped all the way down to 193.6. So it's just kind of doing the thing it does where it fluctuates a pound here and there and then decides to drop. Another thing I just mentioned on my story is that bowel movements have been sparse and small since starting the diet, which is pretty consistent for me, like moving from sufficient or lots of surplus of food into less food. My body kind of takes a little while to figure that out. So I think some of this weight fluctuation stuff probably has to do with that. But so far, so good. I wasn't hungry at all yesterday and just decided not to eat. Ended up getting 185 grams of protein and 2,100 calories overall, which is great because today is my final training session of my deload week. And then that will be great because I'll have all this extra food that I didn't eat yesterday that I can put towards today because tomorrow morning I have like a small dental procedure. And then that's going to knock me out until Sunday. Basically, I'm not supposed to work out till Monday. So I'm going to take 5 days off after this. So big session today, eat a bunch of food, and then go in for this procedure and kind of just chill and do a bunch of work and laze around for a few days before the new cycle starts, which is a metabolic phase. And I'm in the deload week of that metabolic phase right now. I'm going to save the updates on the metabolic phase for our later conversation where we actually talk about metabolic training, which is the title of this episode. Let's real quick just jump through these last updates. I mentioned my mouth procedure, the nasal breathing stuff. A lot of people have been really interested in this, and I've received more DMs about this like obscure topic than many other topics that we talk about on this podcast that are unrelated to hypertrophy, of course. So I figured I'd give you guys an update that I now have mastered the 20-minute walk nasal breathing at a decent pace. I noticed the other day I was walking, not even thinking about it, and I was breathing through my nose, where 4 months ago, I would have been walking, not thinking about it, breathing through my mouth. So progress has been made, and I'm actually curious whether this metabolic cycle will have any potential positive adaptations that transfer over to the nasal breathing thing. So that is interesting as well. HRV stuff. I've been taking HRV and I have, do you do HRV at all, Straker?
My watch picks it up. I will try and pull about one per week that I actually save to an activity download.
What kind of watch do you have?
I have a Garmin Venue 2.
Okay. So I have an Apple Watch, and that is actually the main reason why I want to talk about this, because of those random readings that it does throughout the day. So since I've had my Apple Watch, I've made a dedicated point to do my HRV every morning, first thing before any stress hits me. Like I get out of bed, I get dressed, and then I sit there and I do my HRV type thing. And you can, make the watch do it versus these random readings. And every morning when I do this like planned, very purposeful reading, I get an extremely high score. Like it's somewhere between 180 and 230 most mornings. And then I look at it at the end of the day after it's done the random readings that it does. And all of my random readings are between 30 and 80. So there's this massive discrepancy between what's happening when I'm planning and purposefully doing them versus them just picking up, I guess, my stress levels throughout the day or something along those lines. And so when you dig into like HRV, like what it means for your health and things like that, your heart is healthier, your cardiovascular system essentially being healthier when your HRV scores are higher. So I wonder, and I don't know the answer to this, but which one is more representative of me? Like, am I the person who does it in the morning and I'm like super healthy and my scores are like off the charts high, like top, 5% or whatever? Or am I that person that has these relatively low readings throughout the day consistently? So if anyone knows on the podcast or has any resources that they can send my way, or if you know anything, Straker, I'm very curious on that.
Yeah, I would be open or interested for other people to chime in on that as well. Anything that I have seen has always been in the morning. And largely from everything that I've seen is like HRV is a decent marker for like kind of like preparedness and stress. So it's kind of like those things where you want to read your testosterone first thing in the morning because I'm really bastardizing with this term, but like it gets used up throughout the day, right? And your levels kind of decline. Yeah. I would imagine that's a similar idea of why we want to read HRV in the morning, because you're only going to experience more stress throughout the day, type of thing, potentially, right? So,
well, for whatever it's worth, as a potential counterpoint there is I've started recently forcing it to take my HRV at night before bed as I'm laying in bed, just to kind of see like, is that true that it is just declining throughout the day type thing? And I'm above 150 every night before bed. So it's not quite as high as it is, in the mornings, but it's not in that 30 to 80 range where I am apparently really stressed out throughout the day. So I have no idea. I'm just really curious about it. And it kind of just throws me for a loop when I see those like 32, 38 numbers. And I'm like, but I don't feel stressed. Like, why is this telling me that I'm stressed right now? So anyways, that is a thing. And then the last small topic update I have is the Stronger by Science guys were talking about casein and just protein absorption in general. And I was always under the impression that, you say, well, whey is fast digesting and casein is slow digesting. So you take whey during the day and casein at night or something along those lines. And obviously that's way oversimplified. But what they essentially talked about for like 30 minutes was that casein is in fact not a slow digesting protein. In fact, it is one of the most fast digesting proteins. It's just slower digesting than whey. So I thought that was just interesting, and I didn't know if you knew that.
Yeah, to be completely honest, anytime I get a client coming to me taking casein, I pull them off of it. It's just like superfluous. If you extrapolate, right, let's say you're one of the low protein intake people who wants to lower, right? Like let's say evidence-based protein type person. You are 1 gram per body weight or 0.8, right, per body weight. And this is in grams per relative to pounds, right? So let's use an example, right? You're 180 pound. Let's say you're doing 180 grams of protein per day. 25 of that is going to come from at the minimum, right? A whey, shake, post-workout, pre-workout, whatever. You're going to do another like 25 grams of casein at night. That's 50 grams. So now we're at what? 130 for the rest of your protein. And that's like what, 3 40 gram servings or whatever. Like it generally, when I find it is it's people are just going to do better off eating more like protein sources type thing. And the real reason actually is a lot of people just don't digest it well because casein's rather high in lactase comparatively. And I'm trying to think through the back of my head, like of this year, any client who I had who came to me taking casein also had digestive like problems, and we pulled the casein and the majority of it cleared up immediately with that.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Interesting. Cool. Sweet. Well, what are your updates?
So my updates are, for the first time, I was thinking about running these numbers before we started the podcast. I tweaked my lower back last Wednesday doing my stiff-legged deadlifts in the gym, and it was really painful. Like that day, the next morning, like just getting out of bed, moving was like super painful. But then I was thinking, like I'm 34 now. I started training like seriously when I was 15. I've gone 19 years and never had a lower back injury, deadlifting and stuff like that. Even that's with all the years of being really dumb when we were just doing like way too much type stuff. So it was really interesting. It has, and then ironically, the most painful thing is sitting. I'm standing right now. I have a standing desk here. Walking and standing feel the best. And then sitting down to eat, I've been basically just bending over the counter to eat instead of sitting down because it just bothers it. And I haven't been to the gym, and tomorrow will be a week now. I'm going to go back tomorrow, but for the first like 4 days, like any sort of like bracing or anything, I was thinking like, oh, well, I could go do some like maybe some chest or like, lats, but any kind of bracing and any sort of like twisting motion would kind of like just send me like sharp pain. So I was like, well, I'm just going to take a week off pretty much, see how it goes, try and move through some like lower back, hip opening type stretches like each day. So that is my big update, and it is what it is. Hopefully by like Thursday, Friday, I'll be kind of back in action a little bit there. Have you ever hurt your lower back, Bryan?
Yeah, I've certainly had a few instances of it. So throughout the CrossFit days, I felt like my low back was like on the verge of being injured almost all the time. Like I was always in that state where it like hurts to bend down and get the toothbrush type thing because I was just deadlifting too heavy, too fast without focus on form.
What do you mean bend down? Where is your toothbrush that you bend down and get it from?
I'm just saying you drop it, you drop your toothbrush and you're like, oh shit, I dropped my toothbrush. How the fuck am I going to get this thing, And you can squat down or you can just kind of like bend over and do it, but after you deadlift back, it's difficult. So I'm sure you experience similar feelings right now, maybe.
Yeah, those for like putting my shoes on, putting my socks on was awful.
Yeah.
Awful.
Yeah. So usually the putting the socks on and off thing is like a telltale sign of QL, which is the area that I would usually injure. And so I actually had consistently probably small back injuries, not as big as yours. Like I never felt a pop or anything, but I would call it like a strain to the point where I would have to lay off of hip hinges for 2 or 3 weeks type thing. But it wouldn't affect me in other movements really. But I probably did that every 6 to 12 months from like 2012 to 2019. Like it wasn't until I really started putting that extra focus on form and execution and stuff like that in the hypertrophy training that I really stopped doing that. And I haven't done it since in, 2 or 3 years. So yeah, I mean, to answer your question, it was injured all the time. I haven't had like a really severe one that I couldn't actually do like a chest press or something like that,
Yeah, it's strange because I never had that. Like it would be sore during all like the CrossFit and like heavy training days, but like never. This was like my first ever like back injury where I was training and it just like popped, and I was like, well, fortunately I'm wise enough at this age to know when something in your back pops, you just immediately put the weight down. So that was good, but it is what it is. Hopefully, exactly. Hopefully in the coming days and like another week, it'll all be pretty much back into the swing of things. So that was like my maybe negative update. The other update I have is super positive. So I had the opportunity last week to get paid to give a presentation, teach a class to a team of other nutrition coaches. And that was really, really cool. It was something that I have been moving in terms of like just being, in addition to just being a coach, like an educator in the space is something that I'm really, really passionate about, and just trying to do my part to unwind a lot of the BS and just poor information in the space. So I'm just grateful for that opportunity and having a small like platform and being able to do that. So that has been, it's really cool, kind of a little bit of like a check mark on my big kind of goals and aspirations type thing. So that was my positive update for the week.
Very cool. That's awesome, dude. I'm glad to hear
you.
that. That is always a good feeling to be able to impart that knowledge and have people appreciate it. All right, cool. Well, let's jump into the small little updates we have on the corrections of sorts, I guess you would call it. So the same person actually submitted both of these things. One of them was to basically say that the person sent the wrong link in before. So we'll start with that one. And the question before, this is from our Instagram Q&A 3 episodes ago. The question originally was, do you consider adding a set for an exercise as a way to increase stimulus? Just adding as little sets as needed over the course of a mesocycle, kind of like what Chris Beardsley put together in this infographic. And then he linked an infographic that was wrong because I sat there and I looked at it and I was like, this is about biceps and the volume doesn't increase. So it kind of makes sense that he sent us the wrong infographic. So I'm glad to know that now. But now we have the correct infographic. So if you check the show notes, you should be able to see the correct infographic there. And what is really interesting about this infographic is that I think Chris Beardsley was trying to address the way RP does their volume progressions, increasing sets over the course of a mesocycle. And his example was potentially going from 3 sets to 8 sets over the course of a mesocycle. But his justification for why you would add a set, I think, is the exact backwards reasoning used by RP. So I kind of think, like, I personally like Chris Beardsley's approach a little bit better. So I'll go over kind of both approaches real generally, and then we can talk about it. So in the RP model, actually, let's just do Beardsley. Beardsley's model says that you would add a set if you fail to make progress. So essentially the idea is that you're doing 3 sets and maybe you get 6, 5, 4 on your 3 sets. So if next week, if you go 6, 5, 5, then you don't need to add a set because you already made progress. And then say the next week you do 6, 5, 5 again. Well, then you're like, shit, I didn't make progress. So the subsequent week you would add a set and you would go 6, 5, 5, 4 or whatever it comes out to be. So he's using essentially the basis that progressive overload didn't occur as a reason to be like, hey, well, maybe if you give it some more volume, then you can force progressive overload to occur down the road, maybe. The RP approach essentially says you don't add a set unless you've improved, because they're basically saying like your recovery isn't up to par. You have not realized the adaptations. If you were to add another set right now, you would be pushing yourself further down this fatigue curve. And so anyways, those are kind of the 2 like bird's eye views of the situation. And what are your thoughts on it?
They're both interesting. So when I was looking at it, I guess I misinterpreted it because I missed in the Beardsley model where if it's like week 2, right? Okay. So you go 6, 5, 4, week 2, you go 6, 5, 4 again. I thought it was on week 2, you added the extra set, not on week 3.
Maybe it is. Maybe it is. I'm just saying that you're using, I don't know exactly when you had the set, but you're using the fact that you didn't progress as the catalyst for adding the additional set. Yeah.
They're both models that, granted, like, I don't want to make it seem like I'm down speaking any of them, because let's face it, like models generally work when you follow them, right? And I think in any trainer, it's very beneficial to test a lot of different methodologies, see how you feel, see what works, type of thing, because different things are going to work for different people. I just think from like a practicality standpoint, like I am just inherently not a big fan of the like volume adding approach, because I know if I need to do 7 sets or 6 sets on the hack squat, the first 3, I'm going to be like, what do they call it? Shooing it in or phoning it in. What's that fucking phrase? Is that
phoning it in? Yeah. Like, hey boss, I can't make it today.
I'm gonna half-ass them just because I know I have 4 more after the first 3. Like, and I just think like once I was able to get really clear, and this has only been in this like maybe past year and a half of really leveraging RIR well, like even at like a 2 RIR, I can't do 5 sets of something like that. There's no way in hell. Like I mean, maybe, but then I'm not doing anything else that training day. I can maybe go do like shoulders or biceps, but there's no quads, hamstrings being done. There's no way in hell. Like I'm spent. So and I was literally having this conversation with a client, but it's just, I just don't know. Maybe I need to like hire someone to take me through the volume ramping stuff, because maybe I just need a different approach, or maybe the RIR is supposed to be lower, but it just seems difficult to me to be able to say that those sets are hard. Obviously hard's a subjective term, but at that amount of volume, because you have so much more. Like think about like first quarter versus fourth quarter, right?
Yeah. So you can count me 100% off the volume ramping train. Like I'm not adding sets week to week on anything. Like that might be a tool that's used at some point to be like, hey, I might go from 3 sets to 4 sets once in a mesocycle or something like that. But you can for sure count me off of going from 3 to 6 plus sets over the course of a meso. And that's beyond just the practical piece of, you're doubling the amount of time that you're working. I will say that the RP model is even more than just adding sets, because with the adding of sets, they're also decreasing RIR week to week. So they're progressing 2 different variables independently, which I actually think is a bit excessive as well. Because the way that I do it, and I've talked about in the if you go back to the episode on mechanical tension, I talked about how I like to progress the stimulus. But essentially, you can progress the stimulus in a ton of different ways. Adding a set is certainly a way that you can progress the stimulus. So is decreasing the RIR, or adding a partial rep. If you were, say, at 0 RIR, then the next week you add a partial or 2 partials. There's a number of different ways that you can increase the stimulus. And going from 3 RIR to 2 RIR to 1 RIR to 0, like I'm on board with that. I'm more on board with that than I am with going from 3 sets to 4 sets to 5 sets to 6 sets. But I'm definitely not on board with going 3 sets to 6 sets and going from 3 RIR to 0 RIR with the addition of sets. So to even kind of just one additional point on that is, you mentioned you couldn't even do 5 sets of hack squats, to 2 RIR. But in that RP model, theoretically, if someone can actually do this, you might start week 1 at 3 sets on the hack at 4 RIR. And then the next week is 4 sets at 3 RIR, then 5 sets at 2 RIR. Then you're doing 6 sets to 1 RIR or something, right? So as those sets, which are already demanding at like 4 RIR, but you're adding a set potentially and decreasing the RIR. So practically, I don't see how that works for very many people. But when you actually look at how it's being implemented, and you look at somebody like Steve Hall at Revive Stronger, he has actually moved quite away from the use of additional sets in his own training, but he's still not to say he never does, because I think I've seen him, occasionally do that, but he's found that just increasing or decreasing 1 RIR each week tends to be sufficient for most movements to elicit the response and adaptation that he's looking for. And that really is in line with more of the way that I do my training, where I'm not adding sets. I may occasionally, but it's about progressing that stimulus and whatever that is. And, going down 1 RIR is certainly a quality way of doing that.
I would agree 100%. Two kind of points I have, and then one is a question for you as well. One, somewhere where I will do a little bit of volume ramping is like a volume accumulation point to get to like the volume we want to have for like the training block type of thing. So maybe for one exercise, right, we're going to do like, the plan is to do like 4 sets for like the chunk of the training block. We might start with 2 on week 1 and then 3 on week 2 or something like that, just to help adjust you, instead of being like, okay, day 1, here we go, all this new volume. But then the other question I had for you is, this is something I found a lot to be personally true for myself, how I can really gauge, how I find most easy to gauge actual adaptation and progress is around that 1 RIR effort level, and then seeing like, because at 1 RIR, like I can manage fatigue pretty well for multiple weeks, like unless I'm balls deep in a calorie deficit or something like that. And that way I'm like, okay, well, it was like, maybe it's like week 3 of my training program, maybe even week 4. And for the listeners, personally, I like to run training programs a lot longer than most people do or suggest. I've just found that works best for me. So let's say like week 3 or maybe even week 4, I'm past the neural adaptations and I'm actually getting into like, okay, this is my like 1 RIR. I will progress that for weeks and I'm still able to like pick up, like let's say week 1, right? Week would be like 4 of that intro. So I'm finally at my 1 RIR. I'm doing 100 pounds for 9 reps. On like week 7 or 8 of still progressing this, I might be at like 115 for like 8 reps now. So I've just found that is like the simplest or closest to like a 1-to-1 evaluation of like I'm actually having adaptation because my effort level is remaining the same. And here we go, over 6 weeks later, I have another 15 pounds on the bar for the same amount of reps at the same amount of effort level. And I feel like that's just it's a very like clear progression for me.
Yeah, for sure. I think the one caveat would be the type of movement, which we've addressed a ton in that, like, a pendulum squat versus like a cable curl or something like that. Like you're not getting a ton of fatigue from going to failure on a cable curl. I also think, just to wrap up this point, that if you were to ask or poll like all the kind of top experts in the hypertrophy evidence-based field right now, let's say like Eric Helms, Brian Miner, Dr. Israetel, Beardsley, maybe. I think he'd be a little more on the failure side, but the majority of the experts in the field right now, Cass, would probably all say that like if you just have an average RIR of 1 to 2, then that's like the golden zone. That can mean that you have some sets that are like 3 to 4 or 5, some that are at failure. But if your average RIR just hangs out around 1 to 2, then you're kind of in quality training zone. So I think that's a good message overall.
I would agree with that.
Yeah. Cool. So the same guy that sent us the correction post on that infographic also sent an additional question. In this question, he linked to a YouTube video by Dr. Mike from RP. So today is like the day of Dr. Mike on our show. And he's asking about what our thoughts are on this model idea, a training idea that Dr. Mike put forth. And the idea is called compound isolation compound. So it's CIC. And he's essentially saying you go from a compound movement that is higher stability maybe to isolation movement for the same muscle group, and then to another compound movement for that muscle group. But this one would have less stability. The example, there's a number of examples we can go over, but the main example was you would do some hack squats, you would do some leg extensions, and you would finish with barbell back squats. I don't think this is meant to be done as a circuit. So you're not going hack squat, leg extension, back squat. You're doing sets of hack squat, you're resting. You're doing sets of leg extensions, you're resting, and then you're doing sets of back squats. So this would just be a way for you to organize the exercises, the sequencing in your program for quad day. So I guess Mike's argument is that by having more degrees of freedom on that third movement, it keeps other muscles from being able to take over and reduce the load to the target muscle. So the extra freedom in this example is in the back squat, where your back is not secured like it is in a hack squat. So your hips can move a little bit more freely. And the argument is that if you're doing something like a leg press, which again is like that hack squat where your back is secure, that your glutes could take over because your quads are just so dead tired from the leg extensions that maybe your glutes are going to do more of that work. And so the question from this asker is, I'm wondering, due to the instability of a movement with more degrees of freedom, would it be harder to push that exercise to failure safely and therefore less stimulus than a more stable exercise? So what are your thoughts on that, if you have any?
Well, my thoughts on the question is the word safely. Yeah, I think it would be harder to push it to failure safely because you're much more fatigued. I don't necessarily think that it changes the stimulus. It just changes really how safe you want to be. if you're asking me. But in that same breath, it is a really interesting. I watched the video. It's all entertaining as always, is Dr. Mike. But it is a really interesting concept because for me personally, like the back squat, it was always a really hard hypertrophy, a quad hypertrophy movement because my lower back and hips would always fatigue first. So I think it definitely has some merit. It's 100% worth exploring. But I think like you could do things to help, further tax or stimulate that targeted musculature by having it being pre-exhausted moving into it. And you have to reduce load, which could be beneficial in other potential aspects, like, however much axial loading you want to be doing, that sort of thing. So it's definitely an interesting concept. What do you think, Bryan?
My first gut reaction was that I think the instability in that movement would actually allow muscles to take over more easily than they would in a more stable movement. So like you and I constantly talk about how you can be back squatting and, it can look a lot more like a hybrid good morning back squat movement than, a vertical torso heels elevated type back squat execution. You can do that same thing with a heels elevated, no matter what your intention is. You can send your knees super far forward at the bottom of a squat and look really good at the bottom because you're stronger on the eccentric, right? So you can make that look good going down. But then as soon as you get stuck at that sticking point, what's going to happen if you have no quads is your body's going to be like, well, I'm going to find a way to use my glutes, and you're going to hinge at the waist, and your ass is going to shoot up, and you're basically going to do a good morning with your heels elevated. So I'm a little torn on that because I very strongly believe that at this point in my training journey, I could execute that heels elevated back squat after hack squats and after leg extensions, and that I could force myself to do it correctly and make my quads be the failure, which means that there's tons of other people out there that can do that too. I just wonder if that's like really good practical advice for like the lifting population at large. I think it's a nuanced conversation and one that probably is much more applicable to the advanced athlete that really knows their body and has done a good dose of hypertrophy work in their life, where that would be probably poor advice for somebody at like a beginner intermediate stage, or even Bryan of 2016, when I could squat over 400 pounds for reps. That would be bad advice for me then. So knowing the audience and then maybe being an intelligent audience and knowing whether this advice is applicable to you are probably both important things. My default is to exercise order in the reverse, where it would be back squat first, then potentially leg extension, then potentially hack squat, or vice versa. So yeah, I mean, I would say that my gut reaction is to say that this isn't great advice, but I think that it can be good advice for certain people.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And in defense of Dr. Mike, I do say he specifically said you would use like 50% of the load that you would normally do for a back squat, which I think should help shift your approach into it. But I agree. If you gave me this sort of program 5 years ago or something like that, it would turn into a good morning squat.
Yeah.
So just it would, and because I didn't have the skills or understanding to not do that. I think now this would be like a situation like this is pretty much the only time I would incorporate a barbell back squat.
Oh, I fully agree. 100%. Yeah.
Because I would elevate my heels, use a wedge, reduce, I'm like in a situation like this, I'm probably using 185 pounds max. Realistically, probably more the 155 to 165 for like a 10. And I'm going to do a slow eccentric type thing, full range of motion. Because I just know, like, if I do not do that, it's going to turn into not the target musculature I want, and my back and hips are going to take over. Like but it's taken me 18 freaking years of training to finally learn that. One question I did have though, before we kind of, wrap this up, and for the listeners, we'll put the link or the video in the description so they can go take a look for it. But one thing that I was thinking of, Dr. Mike gives an example for quads, back and chest, which all made sense. And as I was sitting there thinking, I was like, then the third like major muscle group, I was thinking like hamstrings, like how could you incorporate this for a hamstring? So I wanted to see if you had any ideas there, Bryan.
Yeah, my first thought was to go from like a 45-degree hip extension first, and then a leg curl second, and then finish with like a RDL variant third. But again, like I think that exact all my statements and sentiments about the back squat being last apply to an RDL being last, and maybe even more so, because like I love doing short overloaded like leg curls and stuff before my RDLs now, because it allows me to use less weight and feel my hamstrings more and all that stuff. They feel warmed up, etc. But me of 4 years ago, it would have just been like, oh, my hamstrings are completely trashed. We're just going to use my low back to do this RDL now. And so you just have to know your audience and yourself to be able to get the most out of something like that.
I agree completely. And what's really funny is the only scenario that I could draw up in my head of a decent way to use the hamstrings is exactly what you just said.
Yeah, that's
but I was like, I want to see what Bryan's going to say. Like he'll have something different, and we literally thought of the exact same scenario.
Yeah.
What's kind of funny is in one of my current hamstring days, I have a similar sequence, except for the leg curls are first. I'm doing a stiff legged deadlift, so that was second. But then third is I will have the 45-degree hip extension. But I am getting such small amount of reps out of it because they are so done. Like I'm doing like sets of 5 and 6.
Yeah,
because they're trashed.
It's also interesting when you just talk about exercise sequencing in general and like what that effect is on the metabolites that occur in your body, right? So if like, because what you do later on is going to take more of the brunt of the stimulus kind of, right? So if the general order for hypertrophy is to go from short overloaded movements and then finish with more of like a lengthened overload, because once you do that lengthened overload, there isn't like a whole lot left. Like you've kind of used the sledgehammer already type thing. So then if you've used lengthened and then you go to shortened, then now it's more of this metabolic effect because your muscle's already messed up. You're going to accumulate more metabolites in the muscle, et cetera, which is kind of relevant to our next conversation too. But this sequencing that Dr. Mike has is very much like a weird hodgepodge of the two of them, where it's not short to lengthened. It's not lengthened to short, it's lengthened, short, lengthened for the most part when you look at most of the movements that are across the spectrum on there. So I thought that was just kind of interesting too. And then when you look at your sequencing too, if you're putting that hip extension last, then again, you're having like that short overloaded movement at the end, which is a bit more of that metabolic effect.
Exactly.
Yep.
Cool. So we had one more question before we jump into the talk about metabolic training. And this was a really good question I got from Instagram. I think we should start writing down the people that ask too. So then when we speak, they can be like, oh, this is my question, but I forgot to put this person's name down. So the question is, in a bulking, or what I like to use as a caloric surplus or gaining phase, just to reduce the general perception of you're going to get bulky or overweight on a gaining phase, which is not always necessary. Is there any point in carbohydrate cycling if you are not calorie cycling? I see it recommended often, but I was thinking how they overfeed mice to induce diabetes, so I'm not sure if it would actually have any real effect for insulin sensitivity. Plus, it seems inferior for fueling workouts as well. Lots of parts here. Bryan, do you want to take a stab at this one first? Do you want me to?
Yeah, why don't you go first? Because I actually think I'm a little confused by some of the way it's being asked too.
Perfectly fine. So the first thing that I would say here, I take this approach in general. I wouldn't put much value into rodent studies. Anytime I see any rodent study stuff, I'm like, oh, interesting. I'll wait till I get any, human trial follow-ups type stuff. Because very, very often there is not a lot of carryover. That being said, in this particular context, what they do with those rodent studies, which does actually have carryover in humans, is overfed on a lot of saturated fat for inducing type 2 diabetes, right? Adult onset type 2 diabetes. And there is some carryover for that in human trials. So first, it's a different population, right? It's always important to understand the context of the population it's done on. So the overfeeding stuff is generally not on your fitness enthusiasts, bodybuilders, that sort of thing. So that's the first part. Second, I do see a point in carbohydrate cycling when you are not calorie cycling. Reason being is in a gaining phase, something that is not going to be as a signal that is not going to be as strong as in maintenance or in a caloric surplus is your hunger. And carbohydrate requires a lot more volume relative to dietary fat at equal amounts of calories. So to answer the third part of the question, it seems inferior for fueling workouts as well. I would agree with this. And the approach that I generally would take and would recommend that you take in this particular context is on your non-training days, you keep your calories the same if you would like to, but just push over a portion of the carbohydrate calories to dietary fat. That way you can more easily meet your daily calorie needs on your rest days when your hunger is lower because you are not training as much. So in such, calories remain isocaloric day to day. You are still hitting that same caloric surplus signaling threshold for your non-training days, but you can reduce the overall amount of volume you're eating, which helps with hunger or lack thereof, I should say, in these particular contexts. So really good question. A couple of different cool angles that it was asked in, and that is what I would recommend doing. The last part that I did forget to hit, it may not have as much benefit for insulin sensitivity since your total caloric intake is still higher, but it still would have benefit there in coordination with some other things like walking after meals, right? Making sure that you're not having like 200 grams of carbohydrate in certain meals and stuff. So I would agree that it would have some benefit to insulin sensitivity, especially depending on the type of fats you're filling. If you're doing a lot more monounsaturated type fats there as well.
Yeah, so I don't really have a whole ton to add to that. I think you handled it pretty well. The one thing that I will say, just from personal experience, and I've kind of talked about this before, but even if calories were the same for me I feel like there's something about having that sweet beverage during the workout. And so if that means that you want to sacrifice some fat or something later in the day on a workout day so that you can have that kind of peri-workout drink while you're working out, then I think that that's totally reasonable as well.
Yeah, I think we covered that one pretty well. It's a good question. We
Sweet.
Give it some good answers.
Yeah, well, let's just briefly talk about metabolic training. We're already like almost an hour into this thing. So we'll get to the topic du jour now. So metabolic training essentially is the reason we're talking about it. The reason it's relevant is because in my programming, I am currently just beginning a metabolic phase. As I mentioned in the beginning, I'm in the middle of my deload week right now. Initially, I had 4 sessions planned for deload week that were meant to be every other day. So it's essentially like an 8-day week. But due to this mouth surgery thing that I have on Wednesday, I'm only going to do 3 sessions. So my final session is kind of a combo of the last 2. And there's many ways that you can organize metabolic training. Like there isn't a right split or a wrong split. But I think it's important to understand that there, at least when it comes to systemic conditioning, there probably is a better way to organize your training. And that usually would be more of like a full body approach just for the systemic style phase. Because what essentially you're trying to achieve in a systemic phase is increasing your global conditioning, your work capacity, your ability to recover between sets faster on a global level. Like maybe in my next cycle, instead of resting 3 minutes between sets, I can rest 2.5 and still exhibit the same performance. That would be kind of the goal of the systemic conditioning phase. Then there's also our local or peripheral conditioning phase. And this is where we're trying to increase work capacity, but within the specific muscle itself. So systemic conditioning is like, let's get the whole body just better at work capacity. Let's like increase VO2 max, all of the different processes that occur. And then the local one is about like, hey, let's make my chest better at responding. Let's make my back or my quads or something like that. Let's make them more resilient so that they can flush metabolites quicker, recover better between sessions, between sets, things like that. So they also become more resilient or more receptive rather to carbohydrate intake. So that's one super great benefit of either phase. But I think, specifically when you're looking at the local conditioning phase and you're targeting that muscle tissue, that potentially signals that muscle tissue to store more glycogen. And I know I've heard Cass mention before that they've actually seen in their lab that after doing the local conditioning stuff, that they've seen bigger pumps than prior that stay for longer. So I think that's pretty cool. But I also want to mention real quick, because I get this confusion a lot from people where they think that because I went through the N1 course that like I'm kind of parroting N1 stuff a lot. And it's important to note that my design of this conditioning phase that I'm going to talk about has some of the things that I've learned from N1 in it. Yes, for sure. But I wouldn't want you to receive this as, this is the way N1 constructs a metabolic phase of training, because I've been writing metabolic phases of training before I even knew what N1 was. So I have influences into the way I design these cycles that, yes, include N1, but also include influences from the past and current time that are not N1. So this is more just like the way Bryan does it with some influence from N1. So just a quick aside there. But so when we're looking at these two phases, you have systemic and you have local or peripheral. The length design of these types of cycles, it doesn't need to be extremely long because adaptations in work capacity, in the ability to clear metabolites, things like that, these happen pretty quickly. So I think 2 to 3 weeks of systemic and 2 to 3 weeks of metabolic would be on the longer end. Like I've designed metabolic cycles before that are 3 weeks long, where there's 1 week of systemic and then 2 weeks of local peripheral. So a number of ways to go about that. The plan with my design here is to do this 1 week deload that's done in the systemic fashion, and then to have 2 weeks of systemic conditioning as work weeks and 2 weeks of local as work weeks. So it's essentially 5 weeks, but one of them is a deload week. Any thoughts before I continue, Mr. Straker?
Yeah, the local, more so on the local systemic stuff. It's really interesting, and one way to really, for listeners to see it in practice, is if you ever train with someone who does like a different style of training, right? So for instance, when I was in Arizona, one of my old clients was like coming through town and we trained together, and he's like a legit, like a high level power lifter. And he, even though he's like so much stronger than me, was just buried doing one of my lower body sessions because like reps were higher, the rest was lower, even though we were still doing like 2 to 3 minutes. But it was really, really interesting. And then afterwards he was like, demolished. He said for days, or to me it was like, this is fucking Wednesday, dude. Even though like his total like work capacity, or really I should say like strength capacity and stuff, is so much higher.
Yeah.
But it really just goes to show like how your different your time spent in different phases of training will it's dramatically different.
For sure. That's a really good point. And also probably important to note that there's a significantly increased oxygen cost regardless of your size as a human when you lift more weight. Like if you do 600 pounds for 8 reps versus 300 pounds for 8 reps, even if both sets are to failure for one person versus another person, the 600 is going to take 2 times as much oxygen for you to complete that work. So highly more fatiguing to do bodybuilding stuff, and then also when you're really strong doing bodybuilding stuff. But yeah, really good point there. So if he would do that for 4 weeks, he may get some really quick adaptations that then he could potentially go back and apply to his other pursuits. Although I think the applicability of metabolic training to powerlifting probably doesn't have as big of a carryover, but just for general health, always a good idea. The design structure of the systemic stuff is more like kind of like work capacity circuits. I like to pair 3 movements together. And I don't know this for sure, but a lot of the design that I've seen come out of N1 in the systemic stuff, it usually has 2 movements. Like it's kind of like a back squat to a row or a back squat to bench press or whatever it is. Usually it's like 2 movements back to back. I really like 3. Or even 4. Like I'm using 4 right now as well, including smaller movements in the circuit too. So like my main circuit will have 3 movements, and that's usually like a squat pattern movement into a row or pull down type movement into a press of some sort. So you're getting basically the major muscles of the upper body and then the quads and the general pushing structure of the lower body. And then alternatively, a hamstring one on the other day might be like, RDL into some sort of row or pull down again, because we train back a little bit more often. And then that would be into maybe like a bicep or a tricep movement or something like that. And then, so I really like that. But essentially what we're doing is we're resting 45 to 60 seconds between these movements so that you're not doing them as a triset where the second and third movement, like if you do a squat and then you take no rest, whatever you're doing after the squat gets like 0 stimulus. So you do 45, 60 seconds, you're still breathing going into the next movement, but you're not completely out of breath. You can still execute good technique. Take another 45 to 60 seconds and then do your third movement. And I like to decrease the complexity or the demand of the movements as you go. So like going from like squat to bent over row to bench press, like in the bench press, you're laying down. So it's a really good movement to do third in my mind. And then at the end of that third movement, you would take a longer rest, like 2-3 minutes, something like that. And then you'd go through that circuit a number of times. I also really like to organize it in such a manner where the circuit takes you from warm-up sets all the way through one top work set. But really, to like when you're doing this type of training after not doing it for a while, like the second warm-up round feels like death. Like you kind of want to die, even though you're still like 6 reps from failure on everything. And so, the first warm-up round, you're just greasing the groove, going through the motions. Second warm-up round, you're feeling it. Third round is like, ooh, that was like, 3-ish RIR. Like that was really solid effort. I'm breathing really hard. And then the fourth round, you kind of take it to the house relative to the movement that you're doing. And that just feels completely awful. And then I rest for about 3 to 5 minutes and get going into potentially the second circuit, which is usually made up of less complex movements, and then therefore is able to be conducted, for me, easier than if I had more complex, demanding movements in that sequence. And then what was the other thing I was going to say about the second circuit? I usually only do 3 rounds of that second circuit instead of 4 because it feels like a warm-up round is just kind of very unnecessary. So it's like second warm-up round, then first work round, then final work round for that second circuit. So the way that I have this organized is that the first day is quads, chest, and lats. And so that's the main focus. And then the second day is hamstrings, upper back, rear delts, and arms and regular delts, like all the delts and arms. And so that's kind of how I'm organizing the systemic side of this cycle. And they're on alternating days, which has proven really good for me in the past. Like every time I do an alternating day program, I'm always reminded how much I actually like it because I go into every session really, really excited. So that's something, maybe that's specific to me, but I can certainly say that I despise doing 3 sessions in a row. Like the third session, I just have no motivation for it. And even so, like the second session, the next day, I never have as much motivation for it as I do when I'm doing this more alternating day style of programming. So that's kind of a little lesson I'm just going to tuck away into my brain and keep that in mind for the design of future cycles for myself as well. But before I go into the local stuff, any thoughts or statements on the systemic conditioning?
No, just the fact that I mean, I agree. It is an ass kicking. And one thing I guess I do have a question follow up with in terms of like pairing with periodization. Do you have any likes or dislikes for times that can be more beneficial to pair this style of training?
You mean like when would you throw a systemic phase into a hypertrophy block, or when would you choose systemic over local, or?
Yeah, or kind of like do you think it could be beneficially used during a particular nutrition periodization season, right? A caloric surplus versus a maintenance, or maybe the start of a calorie deficit or something like that.
Yeah, so I actually think the metabolic phase is pretty malleable in the sense that it can be used in a deficit, though I would say that if you're going to use it in a deficit, that, like you said, it should be the beginning of the deficit, which is the way I'm doing it. And then also that you need to be open to the idea of high carbohydrate dieting. You can't be somebody that's like, I'm going to go zone and then be doing like these systemic circuits with like basically paleo levels of carbs. So that would be my one kind of caveat there. But yeah, I mean, it increases mitochondrial density, great term. And so there's going to increase like glucose uptake and things like that. So I think that there's definitely benefits to having like a good amount of carbs in the system for it, meaning that a surplus would obviously be like a great time to do it as well.
Yeah, I would. I'm kind of getting sidetracked here, but it would be interesting to see over a long period of time how that could. Because in my mind, right, from a high level thing, yeah, I agree, 100%. It'd be a great time to start with in the beginning of a calorie deficit, one to help getting your body moving through those carbohydrate and stuff. That being said, what we know for like long-term calorie deficit is we want our body to be really metabolically flexible so that we can leverage a lot of our adipose tissue for a fuel source. And then it is kind of like you said, you don't want it to be a long-term thing because you don't want to be doing this style of training on poverty carbs unless you want to get nauseous and have a lot of low hypoglycemic situations. But yeah, really cool input.
Did I ever tell you to listen to the podcast that Ben House did with Casein like 2 years ago? It was like at the beginning of the pandemic. So you would love it because it's the most dorky, like high level. Like they're talking about like how lactate converts to this and then AMP this and like signals this and all these different things. And so as I'm listening to it, I'm always, of course, thinking about, you and your interest in this stuff. So the entire episode is about metabolic stress and then the potential downstream effects nutritionally related to like glycogen and stuff like that, along with a bunch of other stuff.
I definitely need to look that one up. I would love to listen to that.
So good, dude. So good. So anyways, jumping into the local conditioning, the peripheral stuff. So there's kind of two ways that you may implement this, and the N1 uses the IRM method, which is incomplete rest. And so this stems from an old bodybuilder in like the 70s and 80s named Vince Garanda. And he coined a style of training called 8x8. And what he said you would do is basically take your 15 rep max on a lift, and then you do 8 reps and rest 30 seconds and do 8 reps and rest 30 seconds. And you basically do that until you can't get 8 reps anymore, with the goal being that you get 8 sets of 8 reps. Of course, the first couple sets you do are really easy, and then it gets really hard toward the end. So that is one method of kind of local conditioning where you're, as Cass says, pushing on the gas pedal, like revving and then releasing and then revving and releasing. And each time that you go back in and you rev and you do more reps, you're kind of digging that hole a little deeper, to mix analogies, where, the first set of 8 was really easy. The second set was moderately easy. The third set was moderate. The fourth set was moderately hard. And then, progressing from there, the hole's getting deeper and deeper. By the end, you've essentially like done 64 reps or something along those lines of one movement. One caveat to that is that movement that you choose should definitely be a short overloaded movement. So I'll share an anecdote from myself. Back in our CrossFit PB San Diego athletics days, we had our bodybuilding program in like 2014. In 2015, I decided to do a men's physique competition, which we've talked about on the show many times. In my preparation for that men's physique show, I had a chest day in the program that used that 8x8 strategy. So I did incline dumbbell bench press, and I took 60-pound dumbbells, which, I could have done more than 15 times. I could have done them probably 20 times or something like that. But by the time I got to the 5th set, I couldn't even get 8 reps anymore. It was like 8, 8, 8, 8, 7, then 6, then 5, and I was just dead, right? So when I finally met Cass, 4 or 5 years after that experience, and I learned about the IRM method, and I was like, yeah, dude, I don't know how people do that. I only got 5 sets. I was doing incline dumbbell bench presses, and he goes, you chose a lengthened overload movement? Like I should have known better or something, And so lesson learned, dude, got it. No lengthened overload movements. So short overload movements, because they don't accrue the same type of damage. And so they're actually able to be done under short rest. And then of course they're going to, because the contraction is at the short position, so you can think of like a chest crossover, like the hardest part of the movement is when your chest contracts, but it's not super hard back at the like quote stretched position. So you can get almost a rest into that muscle at the stretch position. Whereas when you're doing like a lengthened overload movement, you don't get to rest really at any point. So, I guess you could at the top of the rep, but then you're just resting. But in that short amount of time where you're doing a crossover and then the arm comes away from the contracted position, that actually opens the chest up, allows some oxygen to get in before you then go and deplete the oxygen again. So short overload movements are going to be significantly better for the IRM method. And then another approach to local metabolic conditioning is just kind of the use of either like high reps or same muscle supersets. So I personally have talked about how much I like the use of same muscle supersets much better, because instead of having to do a set of 20 reps where the first 12 to 15 just kind of feel like you're just waving your arms in the air or whatever, you could do like 8 to 10 of a lateral raise and then 8 to 10 of like a cable front raise or something along those lines. And now you've gotten 2 challenging fatigue points in your set, and you've also still done 20 reps. So for me, that makes a lot more sense. And that's the way that I tend to program these things in, is more in the sense of same muscle supersets versus just doing high rep sets. But either one can accomplish that goal of kind of just conditioning your body to doing a higher rep volume. Any thoughts?
Yeah, the main thought, or the biggest takeaway here is, for me at least, and I think maybe potentially for the listeners, is the choice of the type of exercise for like the local, the local metabolic, right? Or systemic,
local metabolic,
yeah, local metabolic. So with that, it's just like, because we've all been there, right, where we've followed like maybe like a GVT, a German volume training or something like that, and you get into those last sets and like you there's no way, but you're doing it with like like you said, a lengthened overload movement, a bench press or something like that, and it goes back to those things like we keep coming like full circle to where training comes back into like understanding these, I don't want to call them like scholastic or like mental aspects of it, and instead of just like picking up weights and putting them down type thing. And like to get really, really good or really targeted, you really need to understand some of the different mechanisms or biases for certain exercises and move and exercise selection too, to really get the most out of what you might want to for a particular phase or something like that.
Yeah, plus it's just super fun and interesting, and after 25 years it's just exciting to be doing like new cool stuff that you're still exploring and learning. So
couldn't agree more.
Yeah, totally. So anyways, I have this metabolic phase. After the dental procedure, we'll be starting it in full force systemic on Monday, which means when this episode drops, I'll be 1 day in, and I'll probably feel pretty awful, but I am looking forward to it. And I actually can say, like, maybe it's placebo effect, but I literally, like, I thought the first deload session I did of this was really hard. Like I finished that session and I was just like, man, like that really hit me in the nuts. Like I wasn't prepared for that type thing. And then for the second one that I did 2 days later, it didn't feel subjectively as bad. And that could be because it was the hamstring delt arm day instead of the quad chest lat day. So maybe it's like less demanding movements or whatever, but I definitely felt subjectively more okay after that second session. So we'll see how it goes today with the mix of the two, where I'll have one quad chest lat and then one ham and delt and arms. But I know that they say these adaptations happen really quickly. I've experienced it as well, where you go from not doing any conditioning work and then you throw any in at all. It's like you go for a run the first time and you can only get 800 meters and you're like, oh man, I really can't run anymore, But within a week or two of running, you're doing 3 miles and you're like, oh, that adaptation happened really quickly. So I feel like it's going to be the same thing with this type of training. And that's going to be really cool because throughout, the past year of doing hypertrophy mostly and a little bit of strength work, you don't notice adaptations happening quickly. So it's kind of cool that you can experience something like that.
I could not agree anymore.
Sweet. Well, that's really all I got.
Cool. So guys, another episode we wrapped up. Hopefully Bryan and I were able to deliver the value as we always strive to do. From Bryan and myself, we will talk to you guys next week.